Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and a brand new adventure is on the way. Yes, that's right. One Night in Karazhan has been announced. It's a brand new adventure, much like Naxxramas or Blackrock Mountain, League of Explorers. The new one is One Night in Karazhan, and 7 new cards have already been revealed for this expansion. So without further delay, I'm going to go ahead and jump in to a card review for 7 brand new cards that perhaps you've never seen before. I'm going to share my thoughts on just how good they are. And to start things off, I'm going to jump into one of the new legendary cards. This is a fellow by the name of Barnes. Now, whether or not you're familiar with the character, who cares? I actually think this card is kind of nutso. I think it's pretty good. It's a 4 mana 3/4. Now that may not sound all that exciting on its own, but this battle cry, summon a 1/1 copy of a random minion in your deck. So first things first, you're getting a 4/5 in total stats because you're getting a 3/4 plus the 1/1. So it's got vanilla stats, right? It's the same as something like a Chillwind Yeti. And you know, a lot of good minions are 3/5s or 4/5s at the 4 mana spot. So the stat totals are not hurting this card. It's playable. Good legendaries like Elite Starseeker can be played with these kinds of stats. And I actually think Barnes is almost that good, or perhaps even better, if you build your deck around his effect. Because essentially, summon a 1/1 copy of a random minion in your deck. What kind of minions does a control deck have? It has Sylvanas, right? It has Ragnaros. Has even Yashiraj. There's all kinds of insane combos that you can pull off with this card if you have good cards in your deck. So this is not an aggro type card. You don't want to summon a Fiery Bat. You don't want to summon an Argent Squire out of this card. You want to get that free Sylvanas, basically. So that on turn 4, you have a Sylvanas that your opponent has to deal with. It can create tons of friction. Yes, they can probably kill it, but do they have a minion on board? Does she steal something? Does it summon a 1/1 rag that still shoots for 8 damage, right? Yeah, of course they can deal with it, but you get an instant 8 damage off of a 4 mana minion that already has a relatively decent body. So the potentials are just insane. There's also Death Rattle minions, right? You don't care if a Death Rattle minion is a 1/1 or not. The Death Rattle effect is sometimes what you care about. So in the right kinds of decks, this could just be a huge turn 4 play that makes a big impact on the board. So I kind of think this card's good. It's got to be played in somewhat slower decks, I think, to be very powerful. But I could see this fitting into control style lists pretty easily, just because you run such a density of good minions. And you know, even if you miss, like even if you hit that Acolyte of Pain in your control deck, right? It's got an effect. It's going to draw you a card. There's very few cards in a control deck, or at least minions in a control deck, because this is guaranteed to be a minion, right? That don't have some sort of positive effect. The only thing that could possibly backfire is something like a Doomsayer, for instance, that your opponent might want to leave alive to kill your Barnes. But that seems incredibly unlikely. You have more good cards than bad cards, particularly minions that have effects. So I can see a lot of upside here. I mean, imagine a 4 mana 3/4 that summons you a Tyrian Forgery. Yes, the Tyrian Forgery just looks like an Argent Squire, but frankly, even if it was just a taunted Argent Squire, that would make this minion insanely good, because a taunted Argent Squire would be nuts. But it's also a taunted Argent Squire that gives you a 5/3 weapon, all for 4 mana. So the potential crazy plays with this are out of this world. I watched the live stream. I don't think they gave Barnes enough credit. I feel like this card could be nuts, as long as you have a deck that is all in on pulling something off with Barnes. Now that doesn't mean it's like all about Barnes. The good cards are good cards regardless of Barnes, but you just need to make sure that you don't have weak stuff in there that he could accidentally pull out, so that you're guaranteed to make a big play out of this. So, you know, in the world of really powerful 4-drops like Fangel Staghelm, is Barnes that good? Maybe not quite, but perhaps he is. I like this card. So let's go ahead and move on to some of the less exciting cards, the non-legendaries that were revealed. First up is the Druid card Enchanted Raven. This is a 1 mana minion. It's a 2/2, so that's already fantastic, right? Really great stat allocation for a 1-drop. Most 1-drops are 1/2s or 2/1s, or a lot of the good ones are 1/3s. But this one's totally vanilla, no effect, just a beast that has a good stat allocation. So clearly this is designed with Druid beast decks in mind, particularly more aggressive Druid beast decks. Enchanted Raven into Mark of Yasharaj, for instance. It's a pretty nutty play. You could have a 4/4 on turn 2 and draw a card. That's the dream, I guess. That said, I don't know that this is in the league of Mana Worm or Tunnel Trog, just because it can't snowball out of control. It's pretty much always a 2/2. You have to use very specific cards to make it better, like Mark of Yasharaj. And I don't know if it's just is threatening or dominating on the early board for opponents. Plus, realistically, 2 health is easier to deal. 3 health, there are cards like Arcane Blast, for instance, to deal with this, or Holy Smite, whatever. There might be a lot of 1-mana spells that can counter this. So, excuse me. So a good card, no doubt about that, as far as like stats are concerned, but I don't think an overwhelmingly powerful card or even a fundamental card. It might open up some Beast Druid options, but I don't think they're going to feel like this card is oppressive. Just an above average, solid minion. Up next, though, is a card that might actually feel a little bit oppressive. It is the Hunter card, Kindly Grandmother. This is clearly a Red Riding Hood reference, with a wolf who is in a grandmother's disguise. This is a 2-mana 1/1 to start, and that is a beast. And it has a death rattle effect, summon a 3/2 big bad wolf, which is also a beast. So you're essentially getting a total of 4/3 in stats for a 2-mana card, which is actually totally ridiculous, right? It's Haunted Creeper used to give you 3/4 in stats for a 2-mana card, which is also nuts. This does it in a little bit different way, right? The 1/1 portion of this card comes up first, and then you get the bigger minion on the second half. Now, I actually think that's a moderate downside to this card, and I'll tell you why. Because on turn 2, when you'd want to play this card, a 1/1 does not trade into stuff very well. Doesn't trade into 2/3s, doesn't even trade into 2 health things well. It doesn't trade into like Flame Imps, for instance. It can maybe pop a Divine Shield from an Argent Squire or something like that, but often it's not going to be making favorable trades on the turn it's played. So what that means is, as a hunter, you have a choice. You can either sacrifice it into a minion on a bad trade to get your 3/2 out, or you can kind of just leave it on the board for your opponents probably to ignore. And then eventually you might find a good, reasonable trade that does 1 damage to finish off a minion. But Hunter doesn't have a ping effect, much like a Mage or a Druid might. So if you need to kill something with 2 health, it becomes very awkward to use Kindly Grandmother. Now, there is a card like Quick Shot that can combine with this to kill 4 health things. I mean, there are ways to kill this, obviously. But I do think sometimes it's going to be a little bit awkward trying to kill off the first half of this to benefit from the second half. So there's going to be a very delayed value effect from this card. Clearly, there's a lot of raw stat value, but it could be problematic to get. The one upside of that, of course, is that does mean you have a beast activator on the field for longer, because your opponents will be discouraged from popping this open to get the big bad wolf out. So that's great for things like Houndmaster, Kill Command. They might leave a beast around. That grants you that beast synergy. Particularly this on 2 and to coin Houndmaster on 3 could be a pretty crazy play, because then they have a 3/3 that if they kill, they get a 3/2 right back, and it doesn't feel very good when you know that there's a hunter who's trying to kill you all the time. So maybe the order of this death rattle effect is actually a slight downside to this card, but still so much raw power packed into this. It's going to be a pain for people to deal with, and much better than the 2-drops that Hunter is running currently, which are basically Huge Toad and King Zelik. This one just has way more stats, much more interesting effect, harder for opponents to deal with, and much stickier, which is important when you do want those beasts out. So I think a significant upgrade for Hunter, regardless of the overall value of this card. Still a big hit for the class. And Hunter's very close to being a dominant class anyway, I think. So The stronger early game here combined with the late game of Savannah Highmane and Call of the Wild, and suddenly you might have a pretty oppressive class. So let's move on to the next card. This one is the Mage spell Firelands Portal. Pretty cool effect there. You can see right into the Firelands. I guess Fandral, Staghelm, and Rag Naros are hanging out there. But I really like this card too. It just seems like the value is off the charts. Crazy good. So you get to deal 5 damage. So that's a little worse than Fireball, right? But realistically, most key things you're trying to kill in Hearthstone have 5 or less health. Very rarely does the 6 damage on Fireball really add up all that much. Sometimes you might need to kill 7 health things with a ping, so there's some downside there. So the 5 damage versus 6 damage isn't, in my mind, that significant of a difference. Rarely will that matter that much. The counter to that argument, though, is, of course, this is a 7-mana spell, so you can only play it after turn 7, at which point the bigger minions do tend to come out. So 6 damage on turn 4 is often overkill, whereas 5 damage on 7 might be a little bit of underkill. So it's kind of a balancing act there, but I still think, Shadow Strike is such a ridiculous card in Rogue because it kills 5 health stuff so easily. You'll see the same kind of thing with Firelands Portal, but of course it's not just a fireball. You also get a random 5-cost minion. So not only do you address your opponent's board, but you build your own board, and that's usually the goal of Hearthstone, right? Kill their stuff, summon your own stuff, and this allows you to do it all in one fell swoop. Now, that said, not every 5-drop's amazing, but most of them on average have pretty solid stats. I need to run through all the different 5-drops. There's not too many, though, that are probably going to be punishing or even undervalued when you consider the total output of this card, right? A deal 5 damage spell is probably a 3.5 to 4 mana spell, and you're also getting 5-cost minions. So you can probably say there's 8.5 to 9 mana worth of value packed into the single card. Plus, since it's a single card, it only takes up 1 slot in your list, and card slots themselves have some value because you only get 30 cards, right? So a lot of value packed into this card. Really interesting design. I don't love random effects necessarily because you could get something amazing, you get something bad, but it's still a fun design, and I don't know exactly what kind of deck this would fit in for Mage. Not a Freeze Mage because it's too expensive to combo, not a Tempo Mage because it's just too expensive. So maybe some sort of like grinder control value Mage. We've seen some decks like that in the past. They've never really taken off a ton, but this is the kind of card like a Reno Mage could play this and probably feel good about it. So I don't necessarily know the home this card lives in, the deck it lives in, but I think it's pretty cool and certainly not terrible by design, although the mana cost being at 7 is perhaps just a little bit too prohibitive and a little too slow, even though it is reactionary. So between the inconsistency and the randomness, the total cost being pretty high, I don't know, this card might actually be difficult to play, but it's not fundamentally bad, I guess is how I'll describe it. Up next is a new Paladin card. It's the 6-mana Ivory Knight, and it's a 4/4, so not great stats for 6-drop, but I actually think it has a pretty good battle cry and might just be playable. Discover a spell, so that's pretty cool, right? Discover effects in general are very good. And Paladin, unfortunately, though, has a mix of good spells and bad spells. So you could get Lay on Hands, you could get Blessing of Kings. Those are what I would consider good spells. Maybe even Seal of Champions is a good spell, just depending on your needs. Those more active things that do something, draw you cards, address the board. Sometimes you might even like Hammer of Wrath, for instance, to kill something, draw a card. But there are also stinker spells, right? There are all the secrets at 1 mana, and those are terrible. Low impact, and if you read the rest of this card, after you discover that spell, restore health to your hero equal to that spell's cost. So if you get a trio of secrets, you're going to be incredibly disappointed because you basically cost yourself a number of stats, because a 6-drop you want to be a 6/7, right, at the minimum. least a 5/5. So you're costing yourself stats for a very weak card that's low impact and low value, and also doesn't heal you. Heals you for 1, so who cares? But then there are also the instances where you get the Lay on Hands, and it instantly heals you for 8, and then you still have a Lay on Hands to heal for another 8 and draw some more cards. And then there's the middle ground, Blessing of Kings, right? Decent heal, good card. So Paladin has a range of spells, but unfortunately most of them are much lower cost. You got Blessing of Wisdom, all the little miniature buffs, all the secrets. So on average, it's going to be hard to get a spell that's more than 4 mana. Like, the Lay on Hands is not going to show up every time. But still, spells are good. It's free cards. It's heals, which certain kinds of paladins love heals. So you can kind of think about this as like a antique heal bot almost. I think the card's called Occult Apothecary in Whispers of the Old Gods that heals based on the enemy board. I might have made that name up. I can't remember names if I don't see the card a lot. But similar mindset, right? A understated body for the cost, but a heal effect. And this even has a card draw effect as well. So this is sort of like Azure Drake and Anti-Heal Bot and Jeweled Scarab all had a baby. And it's the Ivory Knight. So I think it's probably playable on a control style paladin, maybe like a N'Zoth paladin, because it's worse than Ragnaros Lightlord. It's just not super powerful. It's probably a playable card, but not something we see a lot. I think just primarily because paladin spells are too low cost and too inconsistent, so you won't find high impact cards that you need, and you won't heal enough. So I want to like this card. It's okay, but probably not a super playable card. So let's move on to the Rogue card that was revealed. This is the Ethereal Peddler. It's a 5 mana 5/6, so actually insane stats on this card. Really good vanilla stats here. You don't see a lot of 5 mana 5/6s. You got the Pit Fighter, I guess. But 5/6 is way better than 5/5 because there's a lot of 5/5s, and this actually trades into a 5/5 and lives, which is a huge upside. So very notable health total there. But there's also a neat effect that could be pretty good, I guess. It's reduced the cost of cards in your hand from other classes by 2 mana. So basically, it's a sick Emperor Thaurissan discount. It's like 2 Emperor Thaurisans, but only on cards from other classes. So now the card that comes right to mind is Burgle. Burgle gives you 2 cards from your opponent's class. There's also Undercity Huckster, Nefarian. That might actually be it. There's probably more that I'm not thinking of right away, but not that many ways for Rogue to get cards from other classes. So I guess Gang Up could actually do it as well, right? If you gang up an enemy minion and eventually draw them. But the problem is you got to get them in your hand, right? This is a battle cry effect that happens to cards in your hand. So you might have 2 to 3 if it's very good. If you get a couple Burgles off, right? And then essentially you create tempo by reducing those cards and playing them in a big swing turn later on, right? So cool in theory, cool idea, but so far the Burgle style of Rogue has not been viable, and I think Burgle is just too slow of a card for Rogue, who's always looking for tempo and to keep up with the board. And I think this card is just slower. It doubles down on the slowness of Burgle in a way. Like, yes, it helps make up for that slowness by giving you the cost reductions to set up a swing turn. But I think the issue is you got to get the Burgles first. You got to sit on the Burgle cards. You got to draw Ethereal Peddlers. You got to play your Ethereal Peddlers while they're still in your hand. There's just a lot of pieces to put together. Don't think the impact is going to be enough. Like, wouldn't you rather just run Emperor Thaurissan and discount everything in your hand? I mean, you can run both too, I guess, right? It's not mutually exclusive, but it just feels like it's not as strong and a little too inconsistent. That said, it's got good stats, so God, it could fit in some decks just because the stats are okay, and Rogue needs decent minions half the time. But I just don't think this card is going to spawn a new deck archetype unless there's some other pieces to go with it that we haven't seen yet in the Karazhan expansion. So I'm not holding out hope for Ethereal Peddler. Moving on to, I believe this is the last card in my review here, my part 1 review of the One Night and Karazhan cards. This is another legendary. This time it is the Curator. Big golem dude. He's a 7 mana 4/6 with Taunt. So Twin Emperor Veclor comes to mind right away, right? That's also a 7 mana 4/6 with Taunt. Unfortunately, I don't think the battle cry of this one is nearly as good as Twin Emperor Veclor, who summons his twin, which gives you an 8/12 taunt, essentially, for 7 mana. This one instead is a card draw effect. You get to draw a beast, a dragon, and a murloc from your deck. So a very specific card draw mechanic that we haven't really seen before yet in Hearthstone. The problem is that those are 3 tribes that don't typically go together very well. Not many decks want to run both a beast, a dragon, and a murloc. So it's going to take a very specific a deck list to make this card functional. And frankly, a 4/6 taunt for 7 mana is not that impactful on the board. It's going to die pretty easily. So it's going to be slower decks that want to utilize this, obviously. And they're going to have to make that battle cry work somehow. I don't know exactly how. I mean, if you compare this to the old Ancient of Lore for Druid, which is what it was compared to on the live stream, it sounds good, right? Because it's 10 total stats that draws you 3 cards. The old Ancient of Lore that was overpowered, it got nerfed, was 10 total stats, a 5/5 for 7 mana that drew you 2 cards. So theoretically, if you take that correlation, that comparison, this sounds like it should be a good card. But I just don't know what world you use a beast, a dragon, and a murloc in. Specifically the murloc, right? The one murloc that's played in multiple decks is Sir Finley Murgleton. But by turn 7, do you really need to draw Sir Finley Murgleton? Do you want to? Does he help? I don't know. There's a turn 10 play where you Curator into Sir Finley into a hero power of your choice. That makes some sense, right? But then what beast do you want? The first class that came to mind for me with the Curator was Paladin, because they do have a murloc that's just independently good with Murloc Knight. It's one of the only independently good murlocs in the game. Like, it doesn't need murloc synergy to thrive. It can just be a good 6-drop that's 4 mana hero power, right? So Paladin might want to run this card. They also have some dragon synergies, right, with the Dragon Consort, I believe it's called, that discounts your dragons. But then what beast does Paladin run? They don't know that they're going to run any beasts. There are maybe some legendary beasts that will make an appearance, or some high-cost beasts like Stampeding Kodo, I guess. Yeah, Stampeding Kodo's running Paladin. So maybe Paladin is the answer for this card. You get Murloc Knight, you get Stampede Kodo, and you get your dragon of your choice. Doesn't have to be a consort. It could also just be Alexstrasza or Ysera or whatever you want, some late-game control dragon. So Paladin definitely springs to mind more than any other class, specifically because of the Murloc aspect. But still, I just don't know that it's good. It's slow, it's a little low impact. But I do like the idea of thinning out your deck from specific cards, so you can pick out the exact cards you want, and you know what you're going to get. If you only put 1 dragon, 1 murloc, and 1 beast, you know what you're drawing. So it gives you some decision and some decision-making ability and some control over your draw process, which is pretty interesting. So who knows? I'd like to see a deck utilize the Curator, but I don't actually think that we'll see him in competitive play. I don't think he's quite good enough or quite synergistic enough. So that's actually going to do it for part 1 of my One Night in Karazhan card review. We've got 7 new cards. I'm sure there'll be more very soon, as the expansion does launch 2 weeks at the time of this recording. So stay tuned for even more card reviews in the very near future. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.